For our last unit, Unit 11.4, we're going to discuss the many factors that influence intelligence. And then we'll revisit the question from last unit. Do intelligence tests really measure intelligence? After we've gone over all these different factors. So we've had this conversation kind of before, but in different context. Remember the nature versus nurture debate? So it's you can apply that same debate to intelligence. What factors influence the development of intelligence? Are we born intelligent? Is it genetics that contributes to our intelligence? Is it environment? Is it our gender? Is it how we're raised? Is it family environment? Is it schooling? Society's influence. Does poverty play a role? Think about socioeconomic status. Does race or ethnicity play a role? Does political affiliation play a role? So genetic influences. The most genetically similar people have the most similar scores on IQ tests. So it would suggest that that intelligence has a lot to do with genetic predispositions. However, if you'll see here at the graph, identical twins who are raised together have the most similar scores on their IQ, whereas identical twins who are reared separately do have slightly lower scores. So it also suggests that environment does play some role. Maybe not as large of a role as genetics, but it does play a role. To what extent? We may have that discussion. Don't forget about the concept heritability. It's the proportion of variation among individuals that we can attribute to genes. Okay, what did you heredit? What predispositions did you heredit through genes versus what were you conditioned to perceive through your environment? Variability of heritability depends on range of populations and environments studied. Pause the video for a few seconds to study this graph, and then we'll talk about this question. Will a child's intelligence develop more rapidly and more efficiently, it seems, if they're raised by their birth parents or if they're raised by their adoptive parents? What do you think? And the bigger question, why does that make a difference in intelligence? Why does being raised by adoptive parents versus birth parents, why would that impact intelligence, do you think? Now, as we've talked about with the normal distribution curve, there are extremes, there are outliers. To the right side of the curve are the genius, your Einsteins. To the left side of the curve are your abnormal, mental retardation, Down syndrome, mental abnormality people. Mental retardation is a condition of limited mental ability. It's indicated by an intelligence score below 70, produces difficulty in adapting to demands of life, and it varies from mild to profound. Down syndrome is a type of retardation, an associated physical disorder caused by an extra chromosome in one's genetic makeup. Do you remember which chromosome that was? Well, it says it right here, so the 21st. Let's talk about mental retardation for a moment. As you can see, IQ and the severity of mental retardation are inversely related. Here, as IQ scores decline, the severity of the mental retardation increases. Okay? And you can see it in the curve. Okay, the outlier here, where mental retardation would be, as you go along the curve, it increases. So there are different severities. All right? So what are the characteristics of these different severities at these different percentages? Well, it's quite simple. You're going to have to really just memorize this chart. Okay? Individuals with mild retardation may learn academic skills up to a 6th grade level, but may have difficulty with certain adult-type tasks, like achieving self-supporting social and vocational roles. Moderate levels of mental retardation may progress to 2nd grade level academically, but as adults, they may contribute to their own support by laboring in sheltered workshops or living in a state school system. Severe mental retardation, which consists of only about 3 to 4% of the population. They have an IQ score of about 20 to 34, and they may learn to talk and to perform simple work tasks under close supervision, but are generally unable to profit from vocational training and will need assistance, typically some level of assistance throughout their life. And profound or severe mental retardation is an IQ score below 20, It's only about 1 to 2% of the population. As you can see, it's an extreme outlier, and it requires constant aid and supervision. Boys and girls tend to be equivalent in most aspects of intelligence. The average IQ scores of boys and girls is virtually identical. The extremes, both low and high ends, are overrepresented by boys. Why is that, do you think? Girls as a group tend to be stronger in verbal fluency and writing and perceptual speed, starting as early as the toddler years. Remember, girls develop faster physically, so it makes sense that they would develop neurologically and mentally as well. So you see here, girls have faster perceptual speed. Does that mean girls are more intelligent because they can process information faster? We'll talk about that. Boys as a group tend to be stronger in visual spatial processing, in science, and in mathematical problem solving, starting as early as age of 3. So while this may be true that girls and boys have very similar levels of intelligence, George Spearman, if you remember, he would argue that they have very similar general intelligence, whereas girls and boys have very unique and different specific abilities that are unique to their genders. Next, let's talk about group differences and environmental impacts on intelligence. I like to use the analogy of soil and plants. If you have poor soil, then you're going to have really weak, pathetic-looking plants. If you have fertile soil, then you're going to have really lively, large, healthy plants. So if you think about it, our environment's the same way. If our environment is really boring and lame and it's not really engaging, then our neurological development isn't going to be as great. But if we have a really exciting environment, like a rich, fertile soil, then our neural development will be more rapidly developed. Our dendrites will extend at a faster pace, and we will be more intelligent as a result, possibly. So think about how this may relate to school. Think about AP classes, IB classes, and then your on-level classes. The schooling effect is a recently developed concept which seems to suggest that attending school makes children smarter. Children from families of low socioeconomic status and those from families of high socioeconomic status make comparable gains in school achievement during the school year. But what about during summer break? Children from families of low socioeconomic status have a drop in achievement scores. Children from families of high socioeconomic status have achievement scores that stay consistent or raise slightly. Maybe they take summer classes, or they do some type of intellectual camp, like science camp, or they go to astronaut camp or something like that. Why? Because they have the money and they can afford it. So as you can see here, this is a great graph of the schooling effect. We see grades 4, 5, and 6, and we see that as you progress through the grade levels, your intelligence does go up. But notice that it increases throughout the year, and then it has a little dip at the beginning. Well, why does that dip exist? It's because of the summer. When the summer rolls around, you tend to forget a little bit. At least that's how the theory goes anyway. Is that really the case? Is it summer that causes the dip? Or is it just not taking tests all the time, not being in an academic environment all the time? And so because of that, your brain has to reset to get back into that that culture, back into that routine of the school routine of taking tests and being accountable with quizzes and everything. Because that's very similar to an intelligence test. You're taking a test. What do you think is more impactful? How does poverty play a role in intelligence? The more years children spend in poverty, the lower their IQs tend to be. Now, this is not a cause and effect. Poverty does not cause you to have low intelligence. This is a correlation. Okay, children who grow up in impoverished environments and that kind of socioeconomic status, they are much more likely to have lower intelligence scores. Children from lower and working class homes average 10 to 15 points below their middle class age classmates on IQ tests. In many countries, children from wealthier homes score better on IQ tests than children from poorer homes. The greater the gap in wealth in a country, the greater the difference in IQ scores as a result. Chronic inadequate diet can disrupt brain development. And if one is in poverty, they might not be able to afford the most healthy foods because, as we've noticed, like places like Whole Foods, natural foods, your organic foods are typically way more expensive. What's cheaper? You could go down to Taco Bell and get like a 10 burritos for $5 or something like that. All right? But it's not really healthy for you. So chronic, every day, eating a bad diet all the time, chronic or short-term inadequate diet at any point in life can impair immediate intellectual functioning. Reduced access to health service, poor parenting, and insufficient stimulation and emotional support can impair intellectual growth. And all of these things are more characteristic of lower socioeconomic status than higher socioeconomic status. And for that reason, that's why they have an impact on it. That's why it has an impact on intelligence. Next, let's talk about how ethnicity impacts intelligence scores. The average IQ score of Euro-American children is 10 to 15 points higher than that of African American children. Does that have anything to do with ethnicity, you think, or does that have more to do with socioeconomic status? What do you think? The average IQ score of Latino and American Indian children falls somewhere in between those of Euro-American and African American children. The average IQ scores of Asian American children tend to be higher than any other group in the United States. So think about that. Does that have more to do with ethnicity? Just because you're born into a certain ethnicity, you're therefore automatically more intelligent than others or less intelligent than others? Or is it more reflective of socioeconomic status? What do you think? So for example, the average African American IQ score is 90, whereas the average Euro American is 105. Group differences in IQ scores refer to statistical averages, not to any individual score. These are just averages. All right, so again, is this more reflective of ethnicity or socioeconomic status? In fact, millions of African American children in the U.S. have higher IQ scores than Euro American children. There is far more variability within each racial group than between them. So these averages tell us nothing about the individual person. Keep that in mind. Why? Neurological factors, communication style within the culture, cultural values, and plenty of other factors play a huge role in intelligence. These findings do not indicate potential, nor do they tell us what these children would do if they lived someplace else. The current group differences in IQ are due to environmental differences. As discrimination and inequality decreases, IQ difference also decreases. So how do we take all of those cultural, environmental, ethnic variables into consideration? Nutrition. How do we take all those things that we just discussed into consideration when we're taking a test? Well, this is why we use Raven's progressive matrices, and this is a cultural fair, cultural reduced test that would make minimal use of language and not ask for any specific facts, because that can benefit one ethnic group or one socioeconomic status or one group who's more well-nutritioned or who just reads more, whatever. These matrices progress from easy to difficult items, and it measures abstract reasoning more than knowledge of history or grammar skills. Even on culture fair tests, Euro-American and African-American children still differ. One reason, culture can influence a child's familiarity with the entire testing situation. It stands to reason that if a child is more familiar with the testing environment, then they will be more comfortable in that environment and will excel because of that comfort. It's the mere exposure effect. So because of all these things, one has to be very careful of the stereotype threat. This is essentially the self-fulfilling prophecy, but applied to the testing situation and is typically has a negative connotation. The stereotype threat is a self-confirming concern that one will be evaluated based on a negative stereotype. All right, so for example, my wife and I took a dancing class about a year ago. We learned how to salsa. And so when we went into the class, we both commented, "Man, we're going to be the worst people here because we're just some white people from the South who don't have any rhythm and we can't dance." And so because of that, we were more timid, we were more bashful, and we were less willing to participate and make ourselves look foolish. And because of that, we didn't learn as well. Once we were willing to make fools of ourselves and learn from our mistakes and put this stereotype threat behind us, then we were able to get better at dancing. So after all we've discussed, who is better at verbal ability, you think? Girls or boys? Girls. Who's better at spelling? Girls or boys? It's girls. Who's better at nonverbal memory? Girls or boys? Girls. Who's better at sensations? Their hearing, vision, kinesthetic sense. Who's better? Girls are better at those things. Girls actually also have a higher peak. Higher stamina than boys. Girls can run longer typically. Who scores higher on math and spatial aptitude? Typically, boys do. Who tests higher on emotional detecting ability? Yeah, that's girls on that one. But who tests higher in underachievement? Boys. I thought boys were better at math and science and all those things. But why do girls tend to score higher though? Well, it's because boys are the underachievers of the bunch. All right, well, that concludes it. See you guys next time.